The G7 summit in Japan has officially wrapped up after 3 days of discussions from supporting Ukraine to countering China. The meeting saw leaders of the world's wealthiest democracies haggle over Beijing.
Ukraine also secured fresh military assistance, including a $375 million package from the United States.
All right, for more, we are joined by Professor John Blaxland of Strategic and Defense Studies Center at ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. Professor, thank you for joining us. So it seems that G7 is aligning on the newly fashionable term de-risk, not decouple approach to China. I mean, it would surely take some time to de-risk from the world's second largest economy. Will it be effective in changing Beijing's behavior?
Yeah, great question, Julie. Good to be with you. De-risking is the only term that works because decoupling is not feasible. The economies of the West, of the G7 nations, are so integrated with China that the idea of decoupling is catastrophic for them as much as it would be for China, if not more so. So de-risking kind of recalibrates the aspirations in terms of trying to diversify options for sourcing materials and industrial production to basically reduce the prospect of being coerced and manipulated and challenged by China, as we've seen Korea's experience with Lotte a few years ago, Australia's experience with the $20 billion of sanctions. Other countries have experienced this as well, Canada, Sweden, many other countries around the world, including Japan, of course, have been at the butt end of China's sharp power. And it's you've got to hand it to President Xi. This would not have been possible without President Xi's more kind of acerbic approach to international relations and international economic matters. This has only really emerged because all of these countries have come to the point where they've realised that if they don't hang together, they'll hang apart. And there's a real sense that they need to compete, that this is what I would term unrestricted competition. China has been playing cleverly. It's been playing in a game that it's only now that the countries in the G7 are fully waking up to the scale of the competitive challenge that China presents, and that they are looking to protect their interests without unduly complicating life for themselves. So de-risking, not decoupling, is definitely the best way of describing what they're looking to do.
So is this sort of a softening of the previous sort of tough talk we've heard? President Biden also said he's optimistic about ties between Washington and Beijing, saying relations could thaw very soon.
So there is certainly the opportunity for that to happen. We've seen President Xi back away from the wolf warrior diplomacy and that kind of rhetoric. We've seen the situation in Ukraine make life more complicated for China. We've seen the resolve of many of the countries in the West generate this kind of pushback that has kind of opened up a space for a fresh dialogue, if you like, between the two great powers. Led by President Xi and President Biden. My sense is that's what this G7 is about, pre-positioning, making it possible for that discussion to happen. Mindful that quite a lot of issues were covered. This is it had a very expansive agenda about engaging with the global South, having President Zelensky along. President Zelensky, who made a surprise visit and then engaged with some of the leaders of the global South, India especially, the G20 chair this year, Indonesia and others that are really very, very much instrumental in shaping the global South's view on how to respond. And we've seen a diminished enthusiasm for engagement with Russia, a sense of the need to actually push back to some extent. But there's a range of other initiatives that are very interesting to see too on the environment, particularly also Prime Minister Kishida from Japan. His electorate is Hiroshima, I should say. He's obviously been pushing for the endorsement of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and also using that as a point of reference for speaking to Russia about not going nuclear. in response to its dire predicament in its war in Ukraine. So a lot of issues there. The world is facing an enormous set of challenges, let alone the great financial one that the United States is about to face this coming week, which is incredibly important for the G7 as well.
Yeah, Professor, you touched on Ukrainian president's visit to Hiroshima, a chance for him to win over nations that are not firmly backing Kyiv. You mentioned Brazil and India. Why is it important for Ukraine to reach out to these so-called swing countries at this time, and what will it take to win them over?
So I think the personal touch, Zelensky is a remarkably charismatic figure, and he's been very persuasive. I think also there's a growing sense of the need to bolster sanctions. A lot of countries, global South countries, have been reluctant to pursue sanctions, and sanctions really are not effective if you don't get a very broad base for support. So we've seen a tranche of sanctions imposed as a result of the discussions and deliberations. And that is something that is, for that to work, as I say, Zelensky, the G7 have to reach out and appeal to the global South in the sense that it's in their interests to not let this kind of brutal authoritarian behaviour go unchallenged. It has a terrible precedent effect for global international relations. And with so many of the global institutions under challenge at the moment, it is considered critical that some kind of resolve is demonstrated to push back against the war in Ukraine. And I think there's growing momentum emerging. So the fact that this meeting happened, the fact that Zelensky was invited, the fact that he was met by his counterparts from the global South speaks to the fact that there does seem to be a shift happening, a sense that the momentum is shifting. But conversely, I think Zelensky recognises also that President Biden has limited bandwidth at the moment. So Zelensky has to appeal to Biden and beyond Biden, mindful that President Biden is going into campaign mode soon, and he's facing potentially competing against former President Trump, who has declared a remarkable cavalier approach to the fate of Ukraine. So there's a window now in the next, particularly this northern fighting season, the dry months of the summer and into the autumn around Ukraine, where the support is critical. That it's in this context that the supply of F-16s is really significant. Of course, a lot of the G7 countries have F-16s, are in a position to supply F-16s to Ukraine, and others such as Poland and the Netherlands, which have considerable quantities of F-16s, can supply them, can help train them, and can facilitate the critical enabling support to maintain F-16 flight operations. So the combination of factors here, this is a momentous G7, a really significant event where key global leaders from the global South, the G7 and beyond, were able to confer on the big issues of the day.
Yeah, Professor, thank you for your insight this morning. You covered a lot of ground for us. Professor John Blaxland from the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU College of Asia and the Pacific.